Anyway, yeah, I spent time teaching in Clancy theater and history, which is my love, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking about the subject I'm talking about tonight, because it fulfills both my criteria. It's a historical event, plus they made a B-C+ movie out of it called The Devil's Brigade, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to pretend to be a military historian. I don't know everything there is to know about the Devil's Brigade or the 1st Special Service Force, but I do know a lot about the first part, their training here in Helena, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. When I was going to Carroll College in 1992, I worked as a waitress at the Exchange Restaurant in Montana City, which is now the Montana City Grill and Saloon. And I was also in the National Guard that year. Well, one Saturday I came to work in 1992, and at a big table in the back were these men and women who were being very, very rowdy. And so I went back to say hello, and I noticed they had berets on the table. And I said, "Oh, you're in the military, so was I." And so that was my first introduction to the men of the 1st Special Service Force. And when I went back to the fort the following weekend, all the road signs made sense then, finally. Colonel Frederick, Mount La Defensa, if you go out there, they're all named after the major battles that the force went through. So anyway, that's what got me interested in the 1st Special Service Force. When I taught at Clancy, I taught 8th grade history, and I said, you know, these kids need to know about these guys. They trained here at Fort Harrison. They were part of World War II history, and so I made them watch The Devil's Brigade, which at the time I probably could have used a different source to teach them, but at that time, with my theater background, I thought, oh, okay, let's make them watch the movie. Then I'd take them out to the fort, and this was in the late 1990s, and Colonel Upshaw was the one who gave the talk on the 163rd on that side, and on the other side was Colonel Radcliffe, who gave the talk on the Devil's Brigade. And of course, the kids had just seen the movie, and I don't know how many of you have seen the movie, but there's a character in there called Corporal Peacock, who was a very beloved character. And so the first thing the kids would say to Colonel Radcliffe is, "Do you know Corporal Peacock?" And Colonel Radcliffe he didn't roll his eyes, but you could see him go, "Oh, another person who's going to talk to me about the Devil's Brigade." And of course, he was polite, and he talked to him. Well, what I didn't know at that time, but found out later in my research, was that, as you may know, Colonel Radcliffe was taken prisoner of war by the Germans and escaped and managed at night to get back to his unit. Well, he was a true hero, and here the kids were asking about this fake guy in this movie based on his real exploits. And what I wouldn't give for this day for them to walk into the museum and say to him, "Hey, do you know Colonel Radcliffe?" And for him to say, "Yeah, that's me." So anyway, that was my experience with the 1st Special Service Force, which got me to where I am today. It's not moving. I have a heck of a presentation. There we go. All right. Helena is typical of other cities that have offered full facilities for utilization by the armed forces. It is, of course, a matter of War or Navy Department judgment where and when the services avail themselves of these facilities. This was written in August 12, 1942 by the Billings Gazette as a way of saying, basically, yeah, well, we know Helena got the fort, but it was just out of a whim from the Navy Department, which, as we all know, is not true. Fort Harrison was picked for a very specific reason, and Helena was the only place on Earth that they could have trained. So Billings was just kind of eating crow or sour grapes at the time. Okay, which was this one? Okay. All right. Well, this all started, this whole 1st Special Service Force, with an idea from an eccentric British scientist, engineer, inventor named Geoffrey Pike. He was a member of the British Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten's group of wartime civilian strategists. Early in the war, the Allies were concerned about the research that the Nazis were doing on potential atomic warfare. Germany had been using the hydroelectric power of Norway to run their plants to manufacture the atomically enriched heavy water that was going to be used for bombs. And Pike decided that one of the problems in fighting in Norway was the snow. And he theorized that if we had a snow machine that could be developed that could transport assault teams over the terrain, then they could sabotage and destroy the hydroelectric stations. Using the element of surprise, a small number of specially trained commandos could do an enormous damage. And in April of 1942, he was able to sell this idea of a guerrilla assault to Lord Mountbatten and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They both saw the merit in it, and they in turn took the idea to the Americans because Mountbatten knew that the British lacked the resources to put this kind of plan into place. They didn't have the men, they didn't have the talent, they didn't have the money, but America did. And it didn't take long for the British to talk to General George Marshall, who got behind the project, and then took it to Eisenhower, who was the head of the War Department's Operation Division. Eisenhower liked the idea, but he soon realized that there was a real big problem. How do you get the embedded troops, once their mission was accomplished, how do you get them out of the country? And this was not addressed. Well, on behalf of the War Department, he decided to send this plan to a young man who was in his office that he thought highly of and have him look it over and give his opinion. And that man was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tyrone Frederick. He asked him to analyze this project and to get back to him. Well, Frederick was born in San Francisco in 1907. He lied about his age to enlist in the California National Guard, and by age 16, he had been commissioned a second lieutenant. At 17, he was accepted in the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. By all accounts, he was opinionated, dependable, modest, and his capacity for organization is why Ike chose him for this, to be in the War Department in 1941. Well, after a careful study, in May of 1942, Frederick agreed with Eisenhower on his original assessment and even came up with several more problems for Project Plough. It looked good on paper, but was essentially a suicide mission, and so Frederick washed his hands of the project. He said the vulnerability of the airborne force inserted into the location far from the target. There were no plans for extraction once they had completed the mission, and no Allied aircraft was large enough nor could be spared to and be converted to drop the snow machine, which was going to turn out to be the Weasel that was adapted for this Norway mission. However, Mountbatten, Churchill, President Roosevelt, and the Allied Combined Joint Chiefs of Staff decided so much effort had already been put into this project that they didn't want to cancel it. So in June, Mountbatten directed Eisenhower to find someone to be commander of Plough and to proceed with the project. Well, after trying one candidate who was not suitable for the position, Eisenhower went back to his golden boy, Frederick, selected him because he said, which is true, he knew more about the strengths and weaknesses of the program, and besides that, he had the personality to do this. And Mountbatten had personally chosen Frederick, and Frederick was kind of flattered by that. So he went ahead and said, sure, I'll take this mission. The mission into Norway was going to be parachuting an elite assault team into the country. They were going to sabotage the key hydroelectric plants, then fight their way to a neutral border. This was slated for December 1942, and by the time Frederick had gone on board, it was already May and June. So in the meantime, work had begun on the snowmobile that would be dropped into Norway, the T-15 Weasel, which you can see a type of it at the Military Museum at Fort Harrison. And by the way, the Fort Museum is an excellent place to see displays on the 1st Special Service Force. If you've never been there, all you need is a photo ID to get on post. But also upstairs in the Military Museum they have up here, there is a little section on the 1st Special Service Force that you should go up there and check out. It is kind of cool. Well, the Weasel would be able to travel all over all types of snow, carry 2 tons of men and arms, and go at speeds at about 20 miles an hour and climb a 20% hill grade. The American manufacturing company Studebaker immediately went on a 24-hour schedule for development and manufacture of the vehicle, and by July there was a prototype which was available. Well, Frederick had to get Project Plough up and running as soon as possible, and the training had to begin no later than late June. And every single aspect of the mission was without precedent. Nobody had ever done this before in the history of the military. So Frederick was giving carte blanche to operate. Eisenhower even said, write up your own mandate. Tell us what you need, which the young colonel did with amazing foresight and a great sense of entitlement. He, and only he, would be responsible for creating the unit. He could get what he wanted from where he wanted it. He could hire foreigners as his advisors, trainers, and instructors. He could place anyone from any country in a command position over the Americans. He could order commanding generals, Army ground forces, and divisions of the War Department General Staff to do his bidding with regard to the new unit. So as you can see, he could do anything you want to get it up. That's how much support he had. In choosing a name for this super secret organization, he threw out descriptions like commando and ranger because he didn't want to draw attention to this. His choice then was innocent and harmless, the first special service force. However, if you're in the military, you know that there is a part of the military called the special services, and those people run the rec hall. They organize the parties. They're the ones that set up the ball games. They rent out tent equipment. They're the ones that do all that. So there were a lot of problems when some guy innocently would come up to a forceman and say, you guys playing a band or something? And it often ended up in fisticuffs. Well, in the beginning, it was planned that the men of the mission were, of course, made up of 1/3 American, 1/3 Norwegian, and 1/3 British. But it was found that the Norwegian government couldn't provide that much manpower, neither could the Brits. So the Canadians, being part of the Commonwealth, the United Kingdom, they became the men that would make up the first Special Service Force. That June, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King approved 697 officers and enlisted men to join the Americans for Project Plough. Well, Frederick built a staff in short order, and he brought in Major John Schenberger to oversee the operations and training, and also sent him on the scouting mission to find the perfect location to train. Frederick, of course, had specific needs when it came to his training location. It, too, had to be unique along with everything else. It had to be isolated and private, had to be near mountains for climbing training, flat terrain, big enough for a landing field, extremely cold place with snow to learn to ski. And, of course, that's why Billings didn't fit. It didn't have the mountains, but that's why. But Helena was the perfect place anyway, so let's not even argue about that. Fort Harrison. This is the force's home, isn't it great? Fort Harrison was authorized by an act of Congress in 1892 and was built between 1894 and 1896. The first companies of soldiers occupied it in 1895, and it had been used by active Army units until 1913. In 1942, it was home to Montana's 163rd National Guard unit, but at the time that Frederick needed it, it was empty because the men were training in Fort Lewis before going to the Pacific. Fort Harrison in 1942 was comprised of deserted, derelict buildings on a dry prairie at the base of some very scenic mountains. However, once the fort was accepted for a training site, there was a flurry of activity. The Army Corps were immediately brought in for renovations and repairs. Tents were used as temporary barracks, and that's what you're seeing there. Construction on permanent barracks was already underway. They had a runway to accommodate troops and had already been laid, and a rifle range was operational. That is one thing the fort did have already up and going, was a rifle range. Well, during the fall, 600 local Helenans were hired to work on construction of the winter quarters. This was a fact everyone on the post apparently was reminded of, because every day when the workers left at night, they kicked up clouds of dust on their way back to Helena because the roads weren't paved. The improvements that were made, they built brand new structures, they laid new pipelines, they strung phone and electric wiring, they built new roads, bridges, and training aids. They added 4 footbridges and 4 miles of blacktop to help with the dust, and started construction on a new hospital. There were 2 great towers for drying parachutes and bulldozers everywhere when the first men arrived. R.D. Merrill Construction Company of Helena was the principal contractor, with Carlson Plumbing and Palmquist Electric during the electrical work. And I'm hoping that some of these names I throw out, you people will know and say, yes, I know them. The first thing the force was going to do for Helena was to supply lots of jobs for the locals who would help rebuild the fort. By July 19th, there was a post commander and 200 support personnel. Major Schinberger had 2 Fort Benning parachute instructors on hand to teach combat parachuting. Norwegian ski experts were due to arrive in December for the skiing part of the training. Colonel Frederick had even brought in a unique hand-to-hand combat trainer named Dermot Pat O'Neill, who would instruct the men in a new form of combat called Chinese martial arts. The first Special Service Force were the first ones to experience jujitsu, judo, karate, and it was all due to this McDermott O'Neill, who I'll talk about later. The men had to be the best and the most courageous. Just as Fort Harrison was unique, the men training also had to be unique. Colonel Frederick arrived in Helena July 19th, 1942, and his men were due to arrive the next day. Well, what sort of men were required for his first Special Service Force? If you've seen the movie, you'll see the men as they pile off the train as a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, which is what Hollywood saw them as. But that is not exactly the case, especially with the Canadians. More than 15,000 men volunteered for this special unit. Frederick handpicked 2,300 that would start training. In the meantime, Colonel Frederick received orders promoting him to full bird colonel, and in time he would become a major general, the youngest one in the Army. Colonel Frederick, the new unit designated the 1st Special Service Force, was described as a unique combat unit composed of especially qualified men skilled in all offensive operations, including marine landings and mountain and desert warfare. Now, you've got to remember that not too many people really knew their ultimate objective was Norway. So that's why they kind of made them a generic, well, this is what they're all going to learn. June 1942, there went out to all post bulletin boards an announcement for volunteers for a certain kind of individual. He was looking for men who had living and working experience in the real world, men who were used to the rugged life. He did take men with questionable backgrounds and dicey military records, but for the most part, by the time the training was over, these guys had gotten it together. The Americans were mostly volunteers, but many were handed over by company commanders who were looking for a way to get rid of troublemakers. However, they, again, were not the undisciplined rowdies that were made to look like in the movie. Although there were actually some men who were had former jail sentences. There were 2 ex-bodyguards of the actress Barbara Stanwyck, and there was a former Kansas City boss who was part of the group. And if someone didn't want to be there, they were absolutely free to leave at any time during the training. Frederick only wanted those who would commit, and it was an easy outfit to get out of. The Americans had to be single between 21 and 35, although the single thing did change later. But at that time, they wanted them single. To complete 3 or more years of grammar school, they were looking specifically for lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, north woodsmen, game wardens, prospectors, and explorers. The Canadians were similar in to the Americans as to what they wanted, but they also had to be fully trained infantrymen and possess knowledge of internal combustion engines because, again, they were going to be working with the Weasel. I know there were a lot of mixtures among the crowd, but underneath it all, they had what it took to go places. You cannot be a parlor cutie when the current business, killing, is your trade. And this was a letter from Sergeant H.P. Nicholas, and I don't know if any of you know him, to his wife in Helena. When I borrowed the pictures off the First Special Service website, I tried to put in the names of the people as much as I could. I just didn't want to flash a picture up there of some unknowns, so if any of you know any of these people, you will recognize them in the picture. The Canadians were brought in under the pretense that they were joining a non-existent 2nd Parachute Battalion, and many of them did not know until they arrived in Helena that they had even joined the 1st Special Service Force. When the best of the Canadians had arrived by train and then marched into camp dressed in their summer uniforms, tan short pants, and puttees, and that's what these are called, the puttees, right here, the wrappings, or some of them had long trousers with short shirt sleeves or jackets, and a piper was marching them down the tracks. And once they were assembled, Frederick did greet them all as they arrived. And you can see, again, another difference from the movie. When the movie starts, William Holden's in a flight jacket and everybody's got gloves on and all dressed cold because it apparently was fall or winter when they shot that in Utah. But here it is in the summer in Helena, and he's saying hello to everybody. In the beginning, they were put in a square tent with a canvas roof and screen door. They were paired off, 2 Canadians and 2 Americans per tent. And they were also issued their training uniforms, which were the overalls and the jump boots. The Canadians and Americans came from many different backgrounds in virtually every state of the Union and every province in Canada. There was some difficulty at first in adjusting. There were fights and tempers did flare, but by the end of the first month, they were working like a team again. This was not the way it was depicted in the movie. You can see the Canadians in their uniforms with the barracks already completed in the background on this one. Well, we thought the Canadians were a bunch of sissies with those skirts on, but when I lifted one of them up, I got the worst beating of my life. And if you remember from the movie, Richard Dawson, who later went on to be Family Feud fame, he did in the beginning, he is accosted by somebody who teases him about his kilt. So some of the things from the movie are, and I'll get to that later, are based on real things that did happen. The Canadians and Americans learned a few cultural things about each other. For example, some Americans from the South had no idea what a Canadian even looked like. They had never seen one. The Americans certainly learned that the word Canuck was not an insult. So they couldn't even say, you rotten Canuck. I was like, so? But it was an insult to say negative things about the royal family. You were not allowed to do that. And, of course, the Canadians took some cheerful kidding with their accent, and we still do it today. Americans had to imitate them by adding A to everything. The relationship between Canadian and American personnel is very congenial and is most satisfactory to both Colonel Frederick and myself, Lieutenant Colonel McQueen, the Canadian officer in charge. The Canadians found out which subjects required a diplomatic approach with Americans. You did not make jokes about FDR, but you could diss Eleanor all you wanted to. That was okay. And they learned real fast not to call an American who was south of the Mason-Dixon line Yank. Couldn't do that. There was a lot of good-natured ribbing, but from these first weeks, mutual respect grew and lifelong friendships were formed. And within a month, there wasn't even such thing as an American or a Canadian. Even visiting officers could not distinguish them apart. There was a magic induced by bringing Americans and Canadians together, learning how to get along. Well, Frederick had 4 ground rules. First, be on time. Those who weren't were dismissed. Second, regardless of rank, everyone turned out for daily fitness training. Third, self-motivation. You either make yourself go or you go. And lastly, he elected to limit discipline to the strict minimum. One of the things that officers who came to inspect later on in the training took exception with was Frederick's lack of making everybody ship-shape military. And the Canadians said, we formed up in front of our huts, and the sergeant in charge had a flashlight and read off the names, and the guys would yell, yo, or hey. Nobody said, yes, sir. So it was very easygoing. Even though Frederick kept a tight ship, the men respected him enough that they knew what line to cross and what not to cross. Because it was a unique mission, Frederick decided the training and organization of the unit would be new and distinctive. And this is different from what you would find in the Army. He had it divided into 3 regiments. Each regiment had 2 battalions, each battalion 3 companies, 3 platoons, 2 sections, 9 to 12 men. And so they would say that they were from like 3rd Company, 2nd Regiment. And that's the way it was divided up. The uniforms. The Canadians and the Americans wore the same uniform. It was utilitarian and it was unique. They stood out from everybody else. As a matter of fact, the blousing of the pants, which is kind of a paratrooper thing, one guy went home on leave to Salt Lake City and had his boots his pants bloused in his boots, and the MPs caught up with him and said, "You're out of uniform. We got to take you in." And he said, "You and whose army?" And it took 60 policemen to finally subdue him. They took him to the officer in charge, and the officer in charge turned to the MPs and said, "You don't know anything about your regulations. These guys are allowed to wear this. Leave them alone." And he was turned loose. So they had their own, like I said, their own way of doing things. And this is what they trained in. And upstairs, you can see an example of the baggy pants that the Germans will later use as a name for them. They're big baggy pants with the huge pockets. They were able to put things in it. And a pair of those are upstairs that for you to see if you'd like. Well, they had the dress uniforms and their work uniforms. They had their hats. They had their insignia, which every good military person has, insignia. And they wore the crossed arrows from the regalia of the inactivated Indian Scouts. No Army outfit since the days of the Indian Wars had been permitted to adopt the arrow insignia. But these guys stood. And this was an embossed pin on their collar. And the lanyards that they wore on their shoulders were very unique also. They were red, white, and blue. They were made of dyed parachute shroud lines. And an interesting story, they had to buy those, and they cost 90 cents. And one disgruntled foreman said, "Oh, you can't make us buy that thing." "True, I cannot," Frederick said, "but I will tell you, nobody leaves this post unless he is wearing one." Well, shortly after, those men who had purchased the lanyard and went on leave into Helena, they came back and they told the other guys that the women loved it. And this comment alone was more than enough to convince them, those that had not purchased one, to buy one immediately. So, the patch on the sleeve is a red spearhead carrying on at the USA in white letters across, in Canada vertically. It was chosen because it was longer and broader than an arrowhead, because it's actually a spear, and it allowed more room for the lettering. I had the feeling right away we were a special outfit. I had the feeling that if I hadn't measured up and they sent me out, I would have felt pretty bad. Many guys were kicked out, and I had to buckle down to stay with it. I think most felt the way I did. Few of the men had any idea just what the mission was that they were being trained for, but it didn't take them long to know that they were being trained for an elite unit. And every 10 who volunteered for the unknown mission, all 10 of those expected to survive. And that's what Frederick was looking for, that supreme confidence, that ability to know that they could go out there, kick butt, take names, and do what needed to be done. Well, when the forcemen arrived at the fort in July, it created much excitement amongst the people in Helena, because they hadn't been this close or personal to the war before. Sure, there were guys in uniforms who were walking the streets, but they were the local Suns and the daily stories in the newspaper about what was going on. But with the arrival of 2,000 men, not 8 miles from town, provided much conversation and lots of entertainment. And the first was going to be the parachute training. But first of all, there were 3 distinct phases to Frederick's training. From August 3rd to October 3rd, they were going to do parachute training, intense physical training and conditioning, demolitions, unarmed combat, weasel operation and maintenance, and weapons training. The second phase, from October 5th to November 21st, continued conditioning and physical training, skiing, and mountain climbing. And from November 22nd, honing the skiing skills, rock climbing, living and operating in cold climates, winter warfare, exercising, and more training with the weasel. The daily schedule, Monday through Saturday, reveille, 0:45 a.m., sometimes earlier, after showering, shaving, cleaning of quarters, roll call, inspection, and physical training, they went to breakfast. At 0800, everyone turned out for the obstacle course, or Muscle Mountain, as they nicknamed it. And after that, they went to their designated training areas, and then they did coursework until noon. The training resumed after lunch and continued till about 5 o'clock. Evening classes were held 4 nights a week between 7 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. So these guys were pretty darn busy during the whole time. The parachute training. Now, parachute training is interesting because, well, for the first thing, they never had to use it, but they didn't know that at the time. And also, it was fun for the locals to come out and watch what was going on out there on the field. They just had to learn how to step out of the plane, how to guide themselves to where they wanted to land, and how to take up the shock of landing. They weren't being learned how to be cute parachutists. All they had to do was get into Norway and get what needed to be done and survive the landing. So, two instructors from Fort Benning had been brought in to teach the men for the basics. They only needed to qualify for 2 jumps instead of the 5 that the parachute units did. They didn't need to learn to the niceties. As I said, it was a simple way to get from point A to point B, and they trained for 10 days, averaging 9 hours a day. Training began the first week of August. Colonel Frederick was a man, and this is not him, but Colonel Frederick was a man who led from the front, and parachute jumping was no exception. So he wanted to instill confidence in his men by showing that there was nothing difficult about the feat. So he, in his impatience, submitted to a 10-minute description of how to twist in the harness and roll so as to absorb the shock of landing. Then he finally said, "That's enough, let's go." He got into the plane, jumped out, parachute open, came down just fine. He did admit that he was a little bit nervous, but he wanted the men to know that he was going to be participating just as much as they were. And seeing him do it would make it so much more difficult for those to refuse. The first phase of the jump, a parachute jump, was given top priority. It also doubled as a second selection process because those who could not get over their fear of heights or sustained injuries that were too bad for them to go on, of course, were sent back to their other unit. And there were some men who actually successfully completed the first jump, but in thinking it over, decided they didn't want to do it, and so they left too. If you got to the door of the plane the first time and you couldn't do it, that was okay. The plane circled back around and you had a second chance. But if you still couldn't do it, then that was it. You were gone. The men started parachute practice in mock jump sheds in one session of about an hour where they learned how to step out the door, how to swing in simulated parachute rigs, and they learned how to control themselves in the air. Then they moved to the packing sheds where they watched the packers fold up the chutes. They were professional packers who packed up their chute. And sometimes the packers were asked to pick a chute at random and go up and jump and have it on their back so that it kept them honest as to what they were doing. Then the men made their first jump, and most landed where they were supposed to. The wind didn't carry them, but a Sergeant T.C. Pattons, who was pretty light, on one occasion landed about a quarter of the mile from camp, and apparently they had to send a jeep to pick him up. Another story that was told at the subsequent reunions, where there were a lot of stories told, this is everybody getting into their planes, and the chutes coming down, was about this man, Cleland Bud Cobb. And apparently, everybody gone up in the plane, they were getting ready to go out, and everybody was real nervous, including Cleland. And he got to the door, jumped out, and then he was known to carry his harmonica with him everywhere, even in Italy. He apparently, as he was jumping, took his harmonica out of his pocket and on the way down calmly played, "I'll be down to get you in a taxi, honey." So, well, it was during this phase that the people of Helena first showed their kindness and concern for the troops. Because during the jumping process, bones were broken, and the post hospital filled to capacity. So many young men were sent to town, and local hospitals were filled with men emerging on crutches just as soon as casts were set. So Women's Club made it their mission to go out and collect as many crutches, canes, and walking sticks that they could to donate to the fort. And they also brought things to liven up the convalescents in the hospital rooms, like bed lamps, radios, magazines, and games. So it gave them an opportunity to introduce themselves to the young men and say, "We're here. We will take care of you." During jump days, Helenans were allowed to come to the fort to watch where as many as 300 soldiers bailed out of planes every day. The locals had no idea what the mission was, why they were being taught the parachutes, and when the forcemen were invited to homes for dinner, the hostesses all knew enough not to ask what was going on, although curious they may have been. 1,125 qualified shooters lined up on the landing strip at Fort Harrison on August 29, 1942, to take part in the ceremony to receive their wings. And since this was a very important part of 1st Special Service Force history, of course, Colonel Frederick, who was full bird by then, full bird colonel, Frederick insisted on personally pinning the jump wings on all the men himself. Well, someone said, in hindsight, they said the parachuting was the easiest part of the training. And again, unfortunately, had they known, this would be the only time they would ever have to use those skills. But getting those wings and walking around with them made them something much more than anybody else was. Well, when the parachute training was over, the physical training began in earnest. And they would hike in full packs, rifles and helmets, for 20, 40, or 60 miles in increasingly shorter time frames. And some of the hikes took place on the Sebin Ranch, where they were trucked out for 90 miles, spent the night in sheep sheds, and then marched up Middle Creek Canyon through Hole in the Wall, over the hump, and down Nelson via Porcupine. And then they had a hot supper of mutton stew when they came back into camp. Then there was the obstacle course, or Muscle Mountain. And it usually took a half hour to negotiate, and obstacles included hand over hand, climbing over an 8-foot wall, going up and down netting, boxing, push-ups, games, and of course running. And each man was required to run the mile in 10 minutes. The majority could do it around 7, and some as fast as 5.5. Former police officer Irishman Dermot Pat O'Neill was recruited by Colonel Frederick to teach unarmed hand-to-hand combat. He had picked up his skills in the Chinese martial arts while serving as a Shanghai cop. When he arrived, he said straight out, "I'm not here to teach you to hurt. I'm here to teach you to kill." And in his 40 hours of instruction, he taught the men the weakness of the human anatomy and how to attack those points. He also taught them how to fight with the bayonet and the force knife, or the V2 stiletto. The knife design was a group effort, with Frederick working on the blade and Colonel Baldwin the skull-crushing pommel. In addition to everything else they were doing, the men also had to qualify on virtually every weapon in the U.S. arsenal, and with German weapons as well. And they were lucky because Frederick was able to get the best of everything, and they had all the toys they wanted out there to play with. Demolitions. Well, in October, demolition training began and proved to be quite popular. Some of the former miners liked to show off their skills by playing a game of chicken with a stick of dynamite. And they would gather around in a circle and throw it to one another. And those miners used short fuses, too. When the chicken threw it away, they would all run, and they all had some close calls. What a fun bunch, I'm telling you. There was never a dull moment. And Sergeant Joe Dauphineus, if you read anything about him, he was a hoot. He was a funny, funny man. Blowing things up. Well, Colonel Frederick liked to keep the training real by giving them actual targets to blow up, like abandoned concrete and steel railway bridges, mines, and smokestacks. And they attacked in zeal. Rumor has it that a bathtub at the Placer was accidentally exploded. I don't know if that's true. They blew up bridges and culverts and objects around Helena, and sometimes in their enthusiasm they would blow up a bridge. It'd be the wrong bridge. And they'd blow up a mine. It'd be the wrong mine. And Colonel Frederick admitted that his forcemen really did mess up part of Montana before they left. Well, by October, the forcemen had ingratiated themselves with the locals in many ways and were being wined and dined as well as entertained by a very proud community. When the newly completed rec hall opened, there was a live stage presentation for the men to put on by several local talented locals. There was also a curtain on the stage there in the rec hall that one guy decided he was going to sign. And pretty soon, several other guys signed. And by the time they left in April, it was signed by almost everybody. And I haven't had a chance to call out to Colonel Reed and say, where is that curtain? You guys still have it. But that was one of the things they had in the rec hall. One of the ladies that performed there was Catherine Cristiano, who was allowed to perform by Tom Alley, who ran the cabin. And Tom Alley, if you might know, was a boxer fighter promoter here in Helena. very well known, and he allowed her to sing out there at the rec hall with the regionally renowned Florodora Sextet. Also popular in town at various recitals was this man right here, Private Lewis Parsons. And Private Lewis Parsons entertained for children at various Christmas parties, teas, and social organizations. And almost every week in the paper there was an article about him performing somewhere. In 1943 he was discharged, and he came back to Helena and opened a piano studio and gave lessons for several years. In October, the Lewis and Clark County Salvage Committee gathered over $1,500 from the sale of scrap material and turned the money over to the 1st Special Service Force for the purpose of purchasing recreational equipment for the new rec hall. The forcemen were being courted by every civic organization in town. Even the Montana Club extended membership privileges to all the officers. Colonel Frederick, of course, was invited to speak at every chamber meeting, every American Legion meeting, every meeting in town. The forcemen found the bars, the restaurants, and the feminine company on South Main very hospitable. There are many stories of Helena's kindness, and this one is from Jack Martin, who wrote in his autobiography. He and a friend were standing on a street corner trying to decide what to do one Saturday when a car pulled up. And an elderly gentleman asked them, did they know what they were going to do? And they said no. And he said, well, why don't you come spend the day with my family in the summer home in the hills? And they, of course, accepted. Well, it turned out to be the Reagan family. He was the head of the Western Dental Association. I don't know if anybody knows him. The Reagan family had 2 daughters, aged 19 and 21. And Mrs. Reagan invited Jack to their home for dinner on several occasions and basically adopted him. And if he didn't call every 3 or 4 days, she was on the phone to the camp to see if he was all right. Well, he courted the daughter Ethel for the rest of his stay here in Helena. And when the war was over, he returned to Helena to propose to her. And in his autobiography, he writes it like this. However, she left shortly after for Minneapolis. Now, I don't know whether that means she left after he proposed to her, or if she had left before he got back. But anyway, Ethel met a young engineer from the American Tin Company, married him, and moved to Mexico City. It was common for forcemen to have the tabs for their meals picked up at various restaurants and bars. With a smile and a nod, someone would let the guy know they appreciated what they were doing and buy their meal or drink. And of course, in the society column of the Independent Record during that time period, it's common to read that so-and-so had so-and-so over for dinner. Kindness was extended and especially appreciated during the holidays, when many hostesses shared the hospitality of their homes with the soldiers who couldn't be there for their families. In early December, the YMCA building was selected to house the USO Center to serve the recreational needs of the visiting servicemen. The boys' section of the YMCA on the main floor, the dining room, and the kitchen on the 2nd floor and part of the basement were named the USO. The members of the Y entered on Fuller Street and the soldiers on Lawrence. And, of course, this building is no longer there. Well, the highlight of Helena's winter social season was the annual St. Peter's Charity Ball. And on January 16th, the 22nd annual ball was dedicated to Helena's adopted boys, with special military decorations festooning the Civic Center. The forcemen were invited to take part in the Grand March, which was led by Governor and Mrs. Sam Ford, which kicked off the event, and hundreds of Helena residents, Montana legislators, and military men attended it. Meanwhile, training continued for the men at Fort Harrison. This time they were up in the mountains on skis, or torture slabs, as some of the Southerners called them. Well, it was sadly at this point, he had known actually in September, that Colonel Frederick knew that Project Plough in the mission to Norway was dead. So in rethinking the situation, the Norwegians did not want their infrastructure sabotaged, as it would harm the local population too. But the powers that be still believed in the force, so they urged Frederick to continue training, and they'd figure out what to do with them later. So the men were taken to Blossberg in Powell County on the snowy western slope of the Continental Divide. They lived in 26 boxcars with bunk beds and 2 stoves, and they did their snow survival and ski training. There were 12 top-notch Norwegian experts, and by the end of February, the instructor said that 99% of the force were competent skiers according to Norwegian Army standards. Well, one of the stories told at subsequent reunions about an event that took place at Blossberg. A bunch of boys were partying one night during their snow training when a few of them decided to hitch a ride to Helena. So they stocked up on a few bottles of beer and they started hiking. Well, along the way, they spotted a railroad engine on the track. One asked, "Can you drive an engine?" "I don't know, I never tried," replied another. So they piled in, jiggling the levers and wheels a little bit, and the next thing they know, they were rolling off to town. Proceeding merrily, they spotted some other soldiers on foot some distance away, so they hailed them. They said, "Come on aboard." Well, the guys turned out to be military police. And it was said that the guardhouse was busy for the next several days afterwards. Well, out in the mountains, the back of the fort, the men again began to socialize with the locals. They became quite fond of Helena, and it permanently made a place in their hearts. Colonel Frederick unabashedly attributed the subsequent success of the 1st Special Service Force to the brotherhood and bonds they formed during their 9 months in Helena. While they weren't training, since my arrival in Helena, I've always found the Chamber of Commerce helpful in the work that I'm doing here. I would like to assure you that helpfulness is sincerely appreciated. I doubt I could have found a better locality in the whole United States for our work. That chamber was extremely helpful in the work of the 1st Special Service Force, was attested at the meeting by Colonel Robert T. Frederick, the commanding officer of the hardy soldiers of whom Helena is so proud. Well, speaking of beer money, apparently once the men got a little training and confidence under their belt, they were known to throw a punch or two. So the Gold Bar was one of those places where, can I back up? When they weren't training, several men had a unique way to make extra beer money. Major Schinberger, who had discovered Fort Harrison in the summer, was deathly afraid of snakes. So he had a unique way of conquering his fears. He would pay 25 cents for every rattlesnake brought to him. Then he would put it in a box under his bed where he fed it until it lost its wild flavor, and then he would ship it down south to be canned, returned, and then he would eat it. Well, it turned out to be a profitable way for some of the guys to make beer money. So they'd go off in the mountains and they would hunt for snakes. So speaking of beer money, apparently the guys got a little rowdy, and one of the places they got rowdy at was the Gold Bar. It became such a concern that property was being damaged there and windows broken that there was talk of making the bar off limits to the men. So Colonel Frederick went to the owner and offered to have the men punished and pay for the damages. But according to, and I have 2 different quotes, according to the story, the owner laughed and said, "Hey, I sell whiskey in this place. Your men come in here, and whiskey tends to excite some people, so I just figure a broken window is part of my overhead." The second quote is, "With the money those boys leaving here on Saturday night, I can afford the damage. They're welcome anytime." But the point being, we want you there. So the first ad was the ad for the Gold Bar before all the action with the military, and now the guy knows a good thing when he sees it. And it was said that Frederick was of the opinion that stopping the men from fighting would be doing away with all that hand-to-hand combat training that they were getting on their own time. Now, I am not going to make it to the Devil's Brigade. So I'm going to go ahead and keep talking about the Helena and the 1st Special Service. But, and maybe I'll come back sometime because the whole Devil's Brigade movie, well, first of all, since I'm not going to get there, let me interject this real quick. They were not called the Devil's Brigade. They were called the Black Devils in Baggy Pants. That's what was written in the diary. That's what the Germans referred to them as. That's what they referred to them as. When the book was written in 1966 by Alderman and Walden, who was, and they will say, you'll read everywhere, Walden was part of the Special Service Force. No, he joined them in Italy, so he didn't train in Helena. But he wrote the book, and the movie was taken from that book. So probably the book was embellished to sell, but the movie obviously was taken one step further and made Hollywoodized. And for some reason, instead of calling the movie The Black Devils, or the Black Devil Brigade, they called it the Devil's Brigade. So you will see, after 1968, always a reference to the 1st Special Service Force as the Devil's Brigade. But that is not what they refer to themselves as. So I talk about that, and I talk about trivia in the movie, and how William Holden was drunk a lot. And just wanted, before I finish this, I do have one really, really good quote. I can't get to it at the end. But anyway, there was a really good quote that was, this movie is about a special commando force that goes to Utah and being trained by William Holden so that they can go to Europe. And it's like, okay, because the movie was filmed in Utah. And when the guys get off the train there, one of the first shots you see is William Holden and Vince Edwards standing there with the beautiful Wasatch Mountains right in the background. So. Anyway, so at some other time I'll come back and talk about that. Marriages in 1942, 413 marriage licenses issued in Lewis and Clark County, 334 issued in 1941. So you can see that there was an uptick in marriages. The last 4 months of 1942 brought 221 licenses. And almost every week in the Independent Record there was going to be an article about somebody getting married. So I'm just going to zip on through this. I really apologize. I didn't know that I was going to have so much.
We'll come back.
Oh, good. I'll do it again. Okay.
Nobody's in a hurry to leave.
Okay, well, that's cool. All right. Well, the love affair between the 1st Special Service Force and the city of Helena continued as men were invited to birthday parties held in their homes. They were invited to home away from home parties at their new USO Center. They were invited to join in exhibition wrestling and boxing matches at the YMCA. And at one event, the Canadians and the Americans fought each other, with the Canadians beating them in the wrestling match. But the hit of the evening in that particular wrestling match was between 53-pound Buddy Larson and 64-pound Vernon Charlton. And a roar of laughter broke loose as the referee called for timeout at the beginning of the match in order to more securely fasten the trunks of an unconcerned Buddy. So that was the big hit of the evening. Well, the biggest show of love came in the form, of course, of the record marriages that took place in Helena from September to December. Thanks to those marriages, thanks to the many local soldiers at Fort Harrison who married women. And well, the deadline for training of the men had come and gone in December, obviously, but they were still training because they had no place to go. And they were just getting better at their conditioning and getting better at what they were doing, and they were fit. And suddenly on March 30th, 1943, it was announced that all training was suspended at the fort, and the 1st Special Service Force was ordered relocated to another training facility. Well, the Helena boys were moving on, but Helena wasn't going to let them go without a great send-off. So on April 6th, they're going to hold a parade. We arranged the parade as a tribute to the people of Helena for the many kindnesses which they have shown our men stationed at Fort Harrison. On April 6th, which was named Army Day in Helena, they had also was the same time they launched the second war bond campaign. The goal in Lewis and Clark County was to raise $1,650,000 to buy 9 bombers. Well, the soldiers marched through town past military and civic leaders on a reviewing stand on the corner of 6th and Main. And it was the largest military parade Helena had seen since World War I. Merchants arranged special window displays downtown. Fliegelmans had a special window display of all the photos of all the local men and women in the service. And after the parade, 3 Army bombers dropped leaflets down on Main Street, urging everyone to buy war bond stamps. And girls from Helena and Cathedral High were selling war bond stamps before and during the parade. And at Hill Park, the Army had a display of equipment, a field kitchen capable of serving 50 men at the time, which the newspaper said later was of special interest to the local housewives. Soldiers from the fort were there to answer questions, and also on display that day were, of course, sled and dogs from Camp Rimini. Office buildings in the Capitol building were closed for the afternoon. Schools were dismissed early, and businesses were closed during the parade. Well, before the last soldier passed the reviewing stand, the board committee was able to report that they had earned enough funds to buy one bomber. And before the end of the night, they had already raised enough money to buy 2 of them. So they were well on their way to reaching the quota. On April 11th, 1943, they boarded 5 passenger trains and headed east for amphibious training in the Little Creek Training Center at Camp Bradford in Virginia. Well, it was a different Helena that spring and summer. Quieter. Gone were the guys in their jaunty caps with the blouse and pants and sharp jackets and red, white, and blue lanyards on their shoulders. Gone was the money that came into the local economy. Gone were husbands and boyfriends. Gone the adopted sons, but not forgotten. We were to leave camp around 2 o'clock in the morning to keep our departure a secret. It was hush-hush. The next morning, we went down to the train station, and the whole damn town was there to see us off. Some secret. After their training in Virginia and Vermont, the 1st Special Service Force set off for Kiska Island and the Aleutians to finally encounter the enemy. While they were at sea, the men heard about the July 6th sinking of the light cruiser Helena in the Battle of Kuala Gulf in the Solomon Islands. So the men all took up a collection, gave it to Colonel Frederick, and had him send it to Helena's mayor, telling him to use the money to replace the cruiser. In the letter was $5,418.80. And the men were under belief that the city of Helena and the state of Montana wanted to pay for the new cruiser. But what Colonel Frederick and the men didn't know was that that was already covered by the war bond. The men had felt that Montana had suffered a personal loss and that they too shared the loss, and they wanted to be a part of it to help. The men of this force feel strong ties with the people of Helena, where the force was assembled and grew up. During the 9 months spent in training at Fort William Henry Harrison, the force acquired its personality. Every man in the force deeply cherishes his memories of Montana and his association with the hospitable, independent people of Helena. You will see many of these men, both Canadian and American, return to Montana to establish homes in your community when this war is over. The letter to Colonel Frederick when he sent the money. And of course, the mayor said, I think the action of the 1st Special Service Force and the sentiment expressed in the letter constitute the finest compliment possible to Montana and to the people of the community. We are fortunate to have these young Canadian and American soldiers as an inspiration. Many of them have expressed a desire to settle in Montana when the peace comes, and when they arrive to stay, they shall have a welcome equal to that in store for our native sons. In fact, we have long since claimed them as Montanans. Let no other commonwealth seek priority. Well, once they got to Kiska, the Japanese had already pulled out 24 hours earlier, so they did go through a great exercise. They had the ability to see what they could do as a team, but then they were shipped back and ultimately went to Italy. And here's a timeline of where they went: to Kiska, to Italy, Mount La Defensa, Anzio, the advance on Rome, southern France, and they were disbanded December 15th, 1944. Helena deserves most of the credit for the drive-in spirit and unity developed among the members of the 1st Special Service Force, feared by the Nazis as the black devils with baggy pants and dirty faces. I've been in many cities where forces were activated, but the cooperation and consideration given us here was such as I've never witnessed anywhere. Helena deserves most of the credit for the driving spirit and unity developed among the members of the force. The first reunions. On December 15th, 1944, when the troops lined up for the last time, and when you line up in the military, you do the dress right dress where you have to stand next to, put your elbow up, and then that's the distance that you stand, and everybody stands up. And when the Americans were called out, or the Canadians were called out, what the Americans should have done by military protocol was to fill in those spaces, because you didn't want to leave spaces, so the Americans should have automatically filled in. When the Canadians left that day, and the command was given, Americans stand fast, Canadians fall out in a column, the Americans did not fill in the ranks. They just stood there. And there were tears, as Joe Dauphinea said, among those tough bastards. The men were dispersed far and wide. By the time they disbanded, 4,284 men had worn the colors. The casualties had led to almost a complete turnover in personnel. Realizing that a brotherhood and bond had been established in Helena in 1942, the men of the 1st Special Service Force decided to hold a reunion, which came yearly. A lot of them were held in Helena. When the war was over, about 50 men, Canadians and Americans, came back to Helena to live. The force was engaged in another advance guard action. They were returning to Helena, their home post. By midweek, force veterans and their families were in evidence in the homes and streets. So this week, Helena welcomes the force on the first full-scale homecoming. It is good to have them here. Today in peace, the eyes of Montana are upon you. They are proud eyes and friendly ones. History may never record the full story of the devotion of duty and the supreme alliance of the men of the 1st Special Service Force. But in the hearts and minds of the citizens of Helena is recorded for all time the memory of the exploits of this legendary band of men. There was a great contribution from this part of the country and from you. To me, the greatest cause was this people, this town, Helena. And Colonel Edward Walker, as you might know your history, he was the one that Lee Harvey Oswald tried to assassinate before President Kennedy in '63. The city of Helena has and will always have your welfare at heart. All of us here are most happy to have you back with us. In many respects, you're Helena's own. And General McAughton, who said this poignant thing at the monument in 1951, I regret that a force with such a magnificent reputation was not allowed to return intact, which was one of the things they did all feel very sad about, is that they left together, but they didn't get to come home together. Members of an elite World War II commando outfit known as the Devils in Baggy Pants arrived in Helena Thursday, their hair a bit thinner and their belts let out a few notches. This was in the 1964 reunion. And here's the memorial. The $5,000 that they sent for the cruiser was held in trust to build a memorial for those that had fallen. And this is what it looked like yesterday in the rain, or Tuesday in the rain. And this is the side of it. This is in Memorial Park. If any of you have ever been there, it's right there. You can't miss it. Over that part I just saw when they first dedicated the memorial, they had a parachute. And they put the names of next of kin, mothers of next of kin, in a bucket, and they pulled out Mrs. De Macedo to pull the parachute off the monument in memory of her son Maurice, who was killed at La Defensa. This is the name of all those who were killed for the 1st Special Service Force. This is the other side of the monument. And this is my personally autographed copy by Herb Goodwin when I saw him in 1992. And these are various other reunions along the way. And this is the part I wanted to get to. Joe Glass and Mark Radcliffe came back to Montana, both of them having married local girls. Mark was from New Mexico, Joe was from Ontario, and both of them died on April 1st, 2012, within 12 hours of each other. They were Montana's last surviving members of the 1st Special Service Force, an American, Mark, and Joe, a Canadian. And there are no more Montana 1st Special Force members alive today. Colonel Frederick, after the war, commanded various training units, then retired unexpectedly in 1951. He had been in a car accident and was severely injured. He was also wounded 9 times during the war. He died at age 63 in November 29, possibly from complications due to his old injuries. The men who came back to Helena, and then I'm almost over. These are names you might, and that should be Radcliffe, not Padcliffe. That was spell check. Roy Seifert, Mark Radcliffe, Robert Plunkett, John Baker, Herb Goodwin, Frederick T. Hubbard Jr., Roy Hudson, Joe Glass, Stoney Wines, John F. Hayden, Alfred Olson, John Tomlinson, Jerry Karasik, Emil Eschenberg, Gene Ferguson, Kenneth Judd, Larry L. Little, John Marshall, Glenn Nelson, Lewis Parsons, there's Mark Radcliffe spelled correctly, Roy Daglish, Woody Drake, Ray McDonald, Orlin Lee Wilkinson, Frank G. Simmons, John Tommy Tomlinson, Vern Rock, Winfred Adams, Robert L. Brown, J.D. Woon, Bob Brock, Crockett Castleberry, Harold Kramer, Bob Durkee, Eugene Pelletier, Doug Peterson, Shorty Rablin, George Sinclair, Lauren Whaling, Ralph Randall, John Walczak, Bob Smith, Leroy Clymer. And these are women who married the force. Now, this is by no means a complete list. This is just what I can find in the newspaper. Grace O'Day, Beverly Clare Hillis, Helen Mannix, Catherine Nelson, Elizabeth Lee, Sadie Poore, Lucille Davis, Anita Nokleby, Betty Baker, Catherine L. Sicklin, Gloria Engel, Dorothy Heller, Dorothy G. Kinnick, Floy Jeunesse, Mary Thorpe, Dorothy Hagler, Willem Mythe, Ellen Isabel Cannon, Joanne Opp, Helen Bosdick, Betty Walker, Dorothy Hall, Louise Reville, Donna Cluten, Alice Virginia Gruber, Edith Bauer, Patricia Krochek, and then that's the Devil's Brigade. So that's where I'm going to stop. But anyway, that is the story of Helena and the 1st Special Service Force that came and stayed in our town for 9 months and left a legacy. The children of the force members who have stayed and built businesses have continued that legacy. How many of you in here today are related to 1st Special Service Force? Okay. This is Mark Radcliffe's daughter, and this is Roy Hudson's daughter. So, 2 of you. All right. So, any questions?